This video is sponsored by the completely free of charge ear training app, OpenEar. Being able to identify the quality of a chord, whether it's major or minor or augmented or whatever, by ear is a really valuable skill. You might have already worked out how to detect the root note of a chord, but then identifying beyond that whether it's a major triad or a minor triad or it has a suspended fourth or something like that, that's really useful information that will help you play the music, help you learn music faster and help you with your just general musical intuition. So today we're going to go through a whole range of really common chord types and give you some well-known songs, some really famous songs that you can use as examples in your head to remember the quality of that chord, remember how it sounds. So let's start with the most obvious chord of all, the major chord, the major triad. Hopefully this is already something that you find fairly straightforward to identify. But if you need an example, there is this song. Do you recognise it? It's Mr. Blue Sky. Mr. Blue Sky by ELO just opens with a F major triad. It's played like that. So the next most common chord type that you'll encounter is the minor triad. And I think once again this is the sort of chord that is fairly simple to identify by ear, but let's have an example for it. And the example is this. Do you recognise it? It's Still Dre by Dr. Dre, and the opening chord of that is a B flat minor triad.
Still Snoop Dogg and D.I. Guess who's back?
So our next chord type is a major seventh, a major triad with the major seventh interval added on top. And the main example I have for this is This Guy's in Love With You, made famous by Herb Alpert. It starts with this pivot between two major 7 chords, D flat major 7 and G flat major 7. And if you thought that song sounded oddly familiar, it's probably because Oasis borrowed it for their song Half the World Away. The only difference with their song is that they only used the major 7 chord on the second chord in the progression, on the F in this example. So that was the major 7, but now let's look at a different 7, let's look at the minor 7. So this is a minor triad with the flattened 7th degree on top, the minor 7th degree. Sounds like that. This is a G minor 7 chord. And you might already be able to guess the example just from listening to this. The example is Rocket Man by Elton John, which begins with a G minor 7 chord.
She packed my bags last night, pre-flight.
So we've had our major 7 and we've had our minor 7, and the other type of 7 we're going to talk about today is the dominant 7, the 7 which is probably the most common type, a major triad but with the flattened 7th on top. And this is such a common type of 7 that we don't even have to say dominant 7. If we just write 7, E flat 7 for example, then it's assumed that it's a dominant 7. And the example we have for this is David Bowie's Let's Dance, which opened by stacking up a dominant 7 chord like that. And you can sort of feel that signature tension of the dominant 7, which is introduced by the 7th note, which creates a tritone within the chord. That's why we have that tension there in a dominant 7th chord. So now let's talk about some slightly less common triad chords, namely the diminished triad. This is just like a minor chord, for example C minor, but the top note of the chord, the G, the 5th, has been flattened down, giving us our C diminished triad. Effectively a minor 3rd stacked on top of a minor 3rd. And a song that opens by climbing up diminished triads like this is Ghost Town by the Specials. So that was our diminished triad, where we take a minor chord and we lower the 5th. The augmented triad is sort of the opposite, rather than a minor chord, we start with a major chord, and rather than lowering the fifth, we raise the fifth. It results in a similar type of dissonance, but a very much different chord. Now we have two major thirds stacked on top of each other. And the example for this one is Oh Darling by the Beatles, which opens with an E augmented triad, like that.
Oh, darling.
So next we'll talk about the suspended 4 chord, which is sometimes just referred to as a sus chord, a suspended chord. It's exactly the same as a major chord, but the third has been suspended up onto the 4th. And that creates this tension, this suspension, which wants to resolve back onto the major chord. And this is the context in which you will almost always find sus4 chords, because that's just the utility that they have. It's being tense and then releasing that tension. And that's how we hear it in the 2 examples that I'm going to show you. The first is Pinball Wizard by The Who, which for its iconic riff moves between a sus4 chord and resolving down to the normal major chord. And the second example of the sus4 chord that I have acts in a very similar way. This time it's Crazy Little Thing Called Love by Queen, which opens with a D major chord, but it keeps sort of shifting to D sus4. So you're getting that bit of movement, that bit of tension, which quickly gets resolved by moving back to the major chord. So that was sus4, where we take a major chord and we move the third up onto the 4th degree. There is another type of suspension that we can do, another type of sus chord, which is the sus2, where we just do the same thing but in the opposite direction. Take a major chord once again, but we move the third down onto the 2nd degree of the scale. Now this is significantly less common, I think because it doesn't have that same utility of having that satisfying resolution from the suspended chord down to the major chord. The sus2 resolving to the major chord isn't quite the same type of resolution. But there are examples that you can find of this chord. Perhaps the most noteworthy example I could find is the opening guitar riff from The Sound of Silence by Simon & Garfunkel, which arpeggiates a E-flat sus2 triad.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
The next chord is the sort of chord that is almost a bit dated now. It's associated more, I think, with the music of the 40s, 50s and perhaps 60s. You don't really see this chord as much now. And it's the 6th chord, which is effectively just a major triad, but we add the 6th degree to the scale. And that results in a bit of a rub between the 5th and the 6th, which are only a tone away from each other. It's not necessarily dissonant, it's not, you know, a semitone away, but it does introduce a bit of friction. And as I said, this is a slightly dated sound. I associate it with songs like Baby Just Cares For Me by Nina Simone, where the opening chord, that chord there, is a major 6 chord. But the main example I want you to latch on to is a song which I think was actually inspired by that era of music. It's Fall on the Hill. That opening chord is a 6 chord, although one of the main differences is that the 6th and the 5th degree are not voiced next to each other, they're actually voiced an octave apart, which sort of diffuses a bit of the tension you'd normally have from that chord. If it was instead voiced with them together, it would sound like that. You get more of that characteristic rub there.
Day after day.
So our next chord is what you could call a 5 chord, but it's more commonly referred to as a power chord. This is a chord that's literally 2 notes. In this example, F and C, that's F5. Now power chords will often be voiced with the root note doubled an octave up. giving it 3 notes in total, which many people would consider the minimum for a chord. Otherwise it's just an interval. Now you most commonly hear these on guitar. They work really, really well on distorted guitar music. Anything from You Really Got Me by the Kinks is based on power chords. Or for example, Smells Like Teen Spirit is also based on power chords. But for a piano-based example of a power chord, let's go with this song. This is All of Me by John Legend, and the first chord in that riff is F5, just F and C. He's added another F down the bottom in the bass, but that is a really clear and crisp example of a power chord on the piano. So here's another chord that's very much associated with the guitar rather than the keyboard. This is an E7 sharp 9 chord, E dominant 7 chord with the sharp 9th degree added on top, which effectively means that we have both the major third, the G sharp down the bottom, and the minor third at the top, which gives it a real sort of crunchy sound. And this chord is widely referred to as the Hendrix chord because Jimi Hendrix used it a lot. You can hear it, for example, at the beginning of Purple Haze. Now it's not just Hendrix that uses this so-called Hendrix chord. Another example of this chord is the second chord in the verse of Michelle by the Beatles. It opens quite cleanly on an F major chord, but then the second chord in the progression is a B flat 7 sharp 9 chord. And that takes us on to the last chord today, which is this one. This is a E minor major 9. In other words, it's an E minor triad with the major 7 added on top and the 9th degree, which results in a peculiar name, E minor major 9, but the major part is actually referring to the 7, not the 9, because regardless of whether the chord's minor or major, the 9th degree will remain the same. If you want to know more about that, then check out my previous video on chord symbols. But this chord is a really common way, almost cliche way, of having a bit of mystery, and it's very closely associated with James Bond. It was not only used in the original James Bond theme, but it's been quoted effectively in many of the other James Bond songs that have been written over the years. Now, if you want to put what we've learnt today to the test, then you can with today's sponsor, which is OpenEar. OpenEar is a free ear training app where you can develop and test your abilities to identify chords by ear. You can practice recognising scale degrees, chord functions, intervals, inversions, or, as we looked at today, chord type. OpenEar is also an open source project, meaning not only can anybody contribute to the app, but it will remain free to use forever. So considering it's totally free and that they've supported the channel by sponsoring this video, do try out OpenEar for yourself. The links to download it are down below.